Welcome to Lucid Horizon, a talk show about the relationship between democracy and education from IDEA TV, this think tank that brings experts on various issues together to unpack the very topics that are related to democracy in the most troubled parts of the world. This week we have Professor Matthew Bunn from Harvard Kennedy School to help us understand the nuclear negotiation between the United States and the European and Russia and China and the Islamic Republic in Iran. Professor Bunn is a James Schlesinger Professor of National Security and Foreign Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. His research interest includes a wide range of issues related to nuclear technology, including terrorism and nuclear arms control and proliferation. And he has been involved in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as the study director at the National Academy of Sciences and as editor of Arm Control Today. Professor Bunn, welcome to IDEA.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so the nuclear negotiation about which probably you're more informed than we are, has been ongoing for quite a while, for almost 2 decades. And in 2015, a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, was negotiated and eventually agreed on with Obama administration, which within, I believe, a year and a half to 2 years after the agreement went into effect, President Trump basically exited and took the United States out of the agreement. And for the last 2.5 to 3 years, a bunch of sanctions have been imposed on the Islamic Republic in Iran. And now we are in the second round of negotiations in Vienna between the new administration in Tehran and Joseph Biden's administration. First of all, could you tell us a little bit about the history of nuclear programs in Iran and whether there is any hope for a second round of negotiation to arrive at a conclusion?
Well, I very much doubt this round will be the one that arrives at a conclusion. I still have modest hopes that the sides will be able to get back to a compliance for compliance accord. That is, everybody goes back to the original deal. The original deal was, of course, a compromise between Iran and the P5+1, that is the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany, or from the European perspective, the EU 3+3. It's a little bit of a misleading name in that the European Union was also essentially involved in the negotiations. But in any case, the original deal would have lifted those U.S. sanctions that were imposed for nuclear reasons, not other U.S. sanctions, all European Union sanctions and all UN sanctions in return for a number of nuclear steps by Iran, intended to ensure that it would take at least a year for Iran to produce enough material for a nuclear bomb, should it ever choose to do so, and to expand the monitoring and verification of Iran's nuclear activities. Now, after President Trump pulled out in 2018, Iran for a year remained in compliance with the deal, even though it was suffering the substantial sanctions that President Trump imposed. And I should say that President Trump also imposed what are called secondary sanctions, meaning that if any other country or company threatened to work with Iran, it would get American sanctions. And so that scared off, even though the sanctions were only U.S. unilateral sanctions, it scared off companies all over the world from working with Iran and engaging in trade and investment with Iran. So the sides came back after President Biden took office It took them, the Biden administration, some time to get organized as to how they were going to handle these negotiations, but they came back in the spring while Rouhani was still president of the Islamic Republic. But the sides were unable during the time when Rouhani was still in office to reach agreement. Iran then called a substantial pause after the new government took office, and the sides came back to the table. As you say, this is now the second round under the new, more hawkish Raisi government. At the moment, the sides appear to be mostly deadlocked. Iran has made a number of new demands, and the West is still asking for Iranian agreement to at least commit to further talks to extend the restraints further in time. After all, 6 years of the original sunset clauses are gone now, since it's been 6 years since the implementation of the nuclear deal. And Iran has made very substantial progress in its enrichment program. Progress from Iran's point of view, very nervous-making from a US or Israeli or Arab point of view. Iran now has the capability, should it choose to do so, to produce enough material for one bomb in probably about a month.
All right. So, I mean, this question and this analysis begs the question of what's the big deal about a country having a big one bomb or two bombs, or for that matter, 10 bombs? The United States has a stockpile of God knows 6,000, 7,000, thousands. Russia the same, China, all the big powers. Is a single bomb in the hand of the Islamic Republic, does it pose that much threat to the peace and security of the world that the government in Iran is banking on basically blackmailing the rest of the world by the threat of development of the sensitive technology and the assembly of a bomb?
Well, first of all, no one believes that Iran would stop at one nuclear weapon if it went in the path of nuclear weapons. The reality is that the vast majority of states on Earth, including Iran, are non-nuclear weapon state parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have agreed never to acquire nuclear weapons. Iran, unfortunately, has violated that agreement and its safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency in the past. It now argues that it is in compliance with those agreements. In fact, it claims it never violated them. That's not correct. But even today, Iran continues to provide information to International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors that the IAEA judges to be false, and refuses to allow the IAEA to follow up on matters such as the detection of uranium particles made by humans at undeclared sites. So Iran's neighbors, both the Gulf states and Israel, are extremely nervous about how the region would look and how it would change the balance of power if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons. And the United States, for decades, has had as a major component of its foreign policy stemming the spread of nuclear weapons to additional states, or for that matter, to terrorist groups, and has exerted considerable power even against its own allies when they were pursuing nuclear weapons, and has successfully stopped nuclear weapons programs in quite a number of states. One of the interesting and positive facts about the nuclear world is there are now more states that started nuclear weapons programs and gave them up than there are states with nuclear weapons. So our efforts to stop such programs succeed more often than they fail, even in the relatively rare cases where states start down that path in the first place. I remain optimistic that we will manage to convince Iran not to cross the threshold to actually producing nuclear weapons. But I am less optimistic than I was a decade ago.
And I suppose all your analysis is based on the assumption that whatever you know about the nuclear activity of the Islamic Republic is what the international community has access to. What if there is a clandestine operation to which the IAEA or the P5+1 or no one else has access to? And what if Iran has a parallel nuclear development program that we will never know anything about and will remain secret? You know, after all, Israel is a nuclear power that remains ambiguous and keeps an ambiguous position with respect to its possession of nuclear arsenal. What if Iran wants to follow suit and have a parallel clandestine and secret operation while negotiating with all the exposed portions of their program? They have this secret program that eventually will result into the bomb and defeat the purpose of negotiation.
So that is definitely a concern, and that is the reason to make sure that any agreement has effective verification, and to continue to focus intelligence efforts on making sure that any secret activity would be revealed. Now, the bad news is that the technology Iran has been pursuing for nuclear material production, which is the hardest part of making a bomb, centrifuges, are small and easy to hide. The good news is that so far the international community has repeatedly detected secret facilities in Iran. First the Natanz enrichment facility, then the various R&D facilities at places like Alayar Electric, then the secret facility underneath a mountain at Fordow, and so on. There have been a series of incidents in Iran in recent years involving sabotage or murder, apparently by Israeli intelligence. The murder of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who led Iran's nuclear weapons effort back in the day when Iran had a nuclear weapons effort that was mostly terminated in late 2003. There was a sabotage of the Natanz enrichment plant, the largest enrichment plant in Iran, that apparently destroyed thousands of centrifuges, although Iran, according to the latest inspection information, appears to have installed replacement centrifuges and have recovered from that sabotage. There was also a sabotage of the facility where Iran assembles the more advanced centrifuges it's now working on. Iran appears to have recovered from that sabotage as well. But I think all of these are also designed to send a signal to Iran that its nuclear program is penetrated by foreign intelligence and that it should not try to go the secret route because it will be found out. Since
2002, where the nuclear program of Islamic Republic was exposed, there have been basically two Republican and two Democratic administrations having policies that vary in some cases and similar in others with respect to the Iranian nuclear program. It seems to me that the most effective counter policy to the Iranian policy of pursuing the nuclear technology development has been the policies of President Trump. What is your opinion about President Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA and the application of severe, as they characterize it, back-breaking sanctions against the Iranian economy that virtually brought it to its halt? And within one administration of President Rouhani, it quadrupled the price of dollar versus Iranian currency exchange. In other words, Iranian currency exchange lost almost 5 to 10 times of its international value, and basically brought the economy to a grinding halt. And assuming that the Iranian government only understands and sees the language of force, And so far, this has been the most effective way of bringing them to negotiating tables. What's wrong with continuing the sanctions until they abandon all the programs in every scale?
Because that's not going to happen. Sanctions have been effective so far. The Trump era sanctions have been effective only in causing pain, not in changing behavior. What we have today, as a result of Trump's, in my view, foolish pullout from the deal, is an Iran much closer to nuclear weapons and posing much more of a danger, therefore, to its neighbors than it did before. We have Iran that was limited at enriching to 3.67% U-235, now enriching to 60% U-235, very close to what it would use in a nuclear weapon. We have Iran with much more experience with advanced centrifuges that can enrich uranium faster and could either facilitate a breakout at known facilities or allow a smaller and easier to hide secret facility. We have Iran with much less monitoring because it ended the extra monitoring called for under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. In every dimension of the nuclear problem, the situation is much, much worse than it was before President Trump pulled out. Now, Iran's neighbors would point out that the nuclear problem isn't the only problem, that Iran also supports armed groups throughout the region. Iran has a missile program. Neither of those were limited by the nuclear deal. And having more money from the lifting of sanctions during the time the deal was in place gave Iran more flexibility to provide money to those armed groups or to that missile program. Whereas the Trump era sanctions are presumably making those things more difficult. Nonetheless, we don't see any huge diminution in Iranian activities in the region since the Trump sanctions. We did see a downtick after the killing of General Soleimani. It appears that Iran took a pause in some of the things that might have provoked further American action after that occurred. But I would expect that we may still see some further Iranian retaliation for that and for the death of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh over time. There is, as you know, an ongoing shadow war in the Middle East, especially between Iran and Israel, but also between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to some extent. And the suffering that is being caused, suffering caused by, sanctions within Iran, suffering caused by war in Yemen, caused by war in Syria, caused by fighting and poor governance in Iraq, is very substantial. And ultimately, what's needed is for Iran and its neighbors to find a way toward a different kind of relationship that allows their peoples to suffer less.
Obviously, the Iranian government, as you very well know, subscribes to a version of Islam that rivals those of Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arab countries in the Middle East. And there is not only there is a rivalry and hostility between Iran and Israel, there's also a huge rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is constantly instigating Shiite groups and arming them and providing them intelligence to stir up unrest in the Shiite-dominant provinces of Saudi Arabia, which are oil-rich regions of Saudi Arabia. Iran has sponsored the Yemen insurgencies against Saudi Arabia, and Iran has armed Hezbollah to the tune of 100,000 missiles, to some accounts, which are all aimed at Israel. Also, Iran prevented Bashar Assad regime from collapsing by introducing direct military arm and assistance to that regime, causing dislocation of some 4 million people and the massacre of 500,000 Syrians. So against all this backdrop, why is the international community? So actually, before I get to that question, is it true that the sanctions, there are basically 3 classes of sanctions, as you alluded into. There are those classes of sanctions that are directly related to the nuclear enrichment program, the class of sanctions that has to do with the proxy groups and Iran's support for the terrorists in the region, and the so-called human rights sanctions. The demands by the Iranian government to remove all the sanctions as part of this round 2 of the JCPOA negotiations obviously is not possible to be accepted by the US or by the Europeans in that regard. Is that true?
So it is true that the Iranians are asking for a removal of all sanctions, and it is also true that the United States isn't likely to agree to that. There are people who have discussed the concept of a more for more deal. As you know, the Biden administration and Israel and others would like to see what Secretary of State Blinken calls a longer and stronger deal. That is something that would extend the restraints of the JCPOA for a longer period of time and make them tighter constraints. But an obvious question is, why would Iran agree to that? The United States today has less leverage than it had before, not more leverage, because now the credibility of U.S. promises to lift sanctions if the United States gets what it wants are completely shot by the fact that we promised before and then President Trump reneged on the deal. And we have a harder line government in Iran than the one that negotiated the deal. So why that new government with facing less American leverage would negotiate a deal that's better for the United States and worse for Iran is a little bit of a mystery. But what people have talked about is, well, if the United States offered more than the sanctions that were lifted in the original deal, then maybe you could get a longer and stronger agreement. And that's where the more for more idea has come from. Everything you say about Iran's behavior is correct. Although, of course, Iranian officials would have a similarly long list of complaints about U.S. and Israeli and Arab threats to Iran. But the reality is all of that would be worse if Iran had a nuclear weapon and had a deterrent that would protect it when it was engaging in all of these other activities. So there was a reason why, in fact, even the Israelis originally urged the Americans, focus on the nuclear issue. The rest of what Iran does, we don't like, it's bad, but we can handle it. But if they have nuclear weapons, that we can't handle. And so that was the reason why the P5+1, which by the way is not just the United States, the whole, all of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council and so on, focused on this nuclear issue as the first step. And everyone involved in that nuclear deal envisioned that it would be, as some put it, not a ceiling, but a floor, that the experience of being able to serve its own interest through cooperation with the West would provide a foundation to build up other agreements to address some of the other issues and possibly build a different relationship with Iran over time. Obviously, none of that happened. We're in a situation where the relationship between Iran and the West is more hostile, and there's more tension and conflict in the Middle East than there was before.
United States has the history of relationship with Soviet Union during the Cold War, which lasted some 70 years after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and eventually this competition and the arms race between the two countries came to end in the 1989 by the implosion of Soviet Union and the decommissioning of the communist regime in that country. Can the United States take a page from that experience of Cold War and imposition of a very expensive arms race to Soviet Union, which eventually the economy of Soviet Union collapsed under that very expensive endeavor that the US basically imposed on Russia, and they could actually manage deterrence in spite of the huge stockpile of nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles that Russia had at the time. But United States actually used its economic leverage, the livelihood and the economic viability of the United States and capitalism compared to the Soviet socialist system, and eventually basically forced them to throw in the towel. Could that model be successful against the Islamic Republic in Iran?
So I see that history a little bit differently. You're absolutely right that it was the vitality of the capitalist system and the poor performance and rot of the communist system that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the United States, following some incredibly dangerous moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, really focused on making sure that we would have nuclear restraint with the Soviet Union and clear guardrails so that the dangers of the nuclear standoff were reduced. I see what the United States is engaged in with Iran in a somewhat similar light, that the dangers of waiting for change in the Islamic Republic will be much less if we can avoid the Islamic Republic being armed with nuclear weapons. And that it may be quite some time before change comes, just as it was quite some time before change came in the Soviet Union. But we need to try to avoid war and avoid nuclear weapons for that period of time until change does come.
And you think that all the incentives of negotiations like JCPOA 1 and JCPOA 2 are providing Iran are sufficient for them to abandon pursuit of nuclear technology?
No, I don't think Iran's ever going to abandon pursuit of nuclear technology. The question is not nuclear technology, but nuclear weapons. And the question, Iran already today has the technologies it needs if it wants to go to nuclear weapons. The question today is a political decision by the Iranian leadership. So far, since 2003, that's 18 years, the world has managed to convince Iran not to take that political decision to go toward nuclear weapons through an adroit combination of diplomacy, sanctions, threats of military force, and other means, including sabotage. I remain at least somewhat hopeful that we will be able to convince Iran not to cross that threshold. Does that mean Iran is going to agree to, abandon nuclear energy? No. Is it going to abandon its enrichment capacity? No. It sees that as key leverage against the West that, it feels has done as many awful things to Iran as you have listed that Iran has done to various countries in the region. And after all, Iran has suffered terribly from sanctions, from a whole campaign of murder and sabotage of key facilities, its list of complaints is long and is real. So I think there needs to be nuclear restraint, but there also needs to be negotiation toward finding a different modus vivendi between Iran and its neighbors and Iran and the West. After all, both Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are now engaged in back-channel discussions with the Iranians, trying to find a different approach to dealing with their disagreements. It's my hope that some of those talks will prove successful. After all, those countries had a very much less hostile relationship with Iran in, say, the 1990s than they do today.
We alluded into a number of actors and players vis-a-vis the nuclear negotiation and the nuclear issue with Iran, including the United States and its allies in the region, Israel and Saudi Arabia. Europeans they're pursuing their own interests in these negotiations, and obviously Russia and China have an entirely different agenda. But there is one player that's been inconspicuously and conspicuously left out of this entire deal, and that's Iranian people. The Iranian regime is extremely unpopular among the Iranian people. Iranian people are pro-Western, pro-open society, upward-looking, highly educated, and they have a burning desire of assimilating with the rest of the world. They like American products, American technology. They come in flocks to European and American universities, and they're highly westernized and modern in nature, in millions and millions, and they're adamantly and strictly against the Iranian government and its ideology and Armageddon ideology. Do you think the West has to capitalize on this split between the Iranian people and the Islamic Republic and bring the Iranian people, give the Iranian people a seat on the negotiation and insist on the human rights sanctions not to be removed and not to be a part of nuclear negotiation, and keep those sanctions having their own characteristic unless and until the government of Iran stops abusing human rights in Iran?
So first of all, I consider myself an expert on nuclear matters, not an expert on the internal politics of Iran. But I think the situation in Iran is murkier than you describe, and there's not a unified view. There is, in fact, very broad support in Iran for Iran's nuclear program. I would say almost overwhelming support. One of the ironies of history is that the person who signed the first contract for cooperation with the black market nuclear network led by Pakistan's A.Q. Khan was Mousavi, who later became the leader of the Green Movement. Number one, it's not clear that if there were a different government in Iran, it would mean there wouldn't be any nuclear program in Iran. There was a secret nuclear weapons program in Iran under the Shah as well. Secondly, the reality is, when a government is in power, it's in control of what happens in that country to a significant degree, and it's the body that other governments negotiate with. So it's not like the United States gets to determine who Iran's representatives are going to be when Iran comes to the negotiating table. The United States can determine its own policies, of course. It can determine which sanctions to lift and which sanctions not to lift. It's my expectation that the full scope of U.S. sanctions probably isn't going to get lifted until there's quite a different relationship between the United States and Iran, and that very different relationship probably isn't going to happen unless there's some progress with respect to political freedoms within Iran. But I will say the United States has quite a number of allies where there are even fewer political freedoms. After all, Saudi Arabia has, if anything, less political freedom than there is in Iran. And there was a time during the Cold War when most of the world's dictatorships, at least the non-communist dictatorships, were governments supported by the United States. So the United States will sometimes grit its teeth and ignore certain human rights issues, as they say, for reasons of state.
Well, it's not just a human right, but it's this lethal cocktail of human rights and anti-Western sentiments that the Iranian government is representing. I mean, Saudi Arabia at least is a player in the international politics. All those third world dictators, such as the South American, dictatorships of the 70s and 80s, were not really threatening their livelihood or the Western economy, as you hear these very harsh rhetorics that is coming from Friday prayer speakers of the Iranian
there's plenty
regime.
of harsh rhetoric against the West in Iran. The notion that Iran, without nuclear weapons, poses any fundamental threat to the West, I think, though, is overstated. Iran is a big country for its region, a pretty small country on a global scale. In military terms, its defense budget is a small fraction of the defense budget even of the Gulf states, let alone the enormous defense budgets of the United States and the rest of the P5+1 and so on. Its economy is a small fraction of even the region's economies, let alone the world's economies. It's important because of its oil and gas. It's important because it has, as you say, an especially educated population. And it's important because of its strategic location. But in terms of really being a serious global power, I would not say, or having the ability to seriously interfere with the global economy, I don't think Iran's in that league.
That brings me to another aspect, another dimension to our conversation, and that is the role of China and Russia, and the fact that we had our own unipolar moment after the downfall of Soviet Union for about 10 to 20 years, which we basically took the leisure of invading Afghanistan and Iraq during that time, and relinquished the superpowerhood status, at least the economic superpowerhood status, to China, and now China is breathing on our neck as far as the economic competition is concerned. It seems to me that the Iranian government is relying on the friendship and the support of Chinese, both in international venues such as JCPOA and the United Nations, and the signing of a 25-year economic agreement, which is worth $400 billion with China, and some kind of support, the military support that it's receiving from Russia. So now we are not in the unipolar moment anymore. We are back into the highly polar world, And in this situation, unlike the old Cold War, which competition was mostly along the military hardware, and there was really not much economic competition between the capitalist world and the socialist world, this time around, the bipolarity has an entirely different nature. The Chinese are presenting a stiff economic competition to the United States and to the Western world in general, and then combined with the military hardware that Russia can offer, we could be in an entirely new era of Cold War, a Cold War that a combination of economic power of China and the military power of Russia could really make life more difficult for us than before, and give breathing room to prior regimes like Islamic Republic. Do you think that the United States has to take that into account and get closer to its European allies? We saw some kind of a drift between the US and Europe during the Trump administration, and even during the negotiations in JCPOA, we've seen some differences between European position and the US position. Do you think that we have to look at the problem of, I mean, actually the problem of the world in general, but in this particular case of JCPOA, in the light of economic success of the other superpower and its alliance, at least in some circles, in the One Belt, One Road, and some other activities that Russia and China have gotten into. Do you think that in the future that the economic success of China will make it difficult for the United States to achieve its political goals in negotiating with smaller states, smaller power states?
Well, so far, I would say both Russia and China have been surprisingly helpful in reaching the original JCPOA and in the talks so far. In fact, I would argue that Russia played a very important facilitating role in making the current talks take place and making sure that even the new Iranian government would at least come back to the table. Now, that being said, you're absolutely correct that China sees opportunities in Iran, is not enthusiastic about sanctions in general, and sanctions on Iran in particular, and that Russia was quite eager to make some military sales once the ban on military sales imposed by the United Nations expired. And I think the reality is, as the U.S. relative power declines, which is inevitable as other countries get stronger and stronger over time, it will get more difficult for the United States to have its own way. But probably the United States shouldn't have its own way on everything in international affairs. I do think on the spread of nuclear weapons, we're fortunate in that Russia and the United States built the nuclear non-proliferation regime together. China has now decided that while it stood away from that regime originally, that the regime serves its interests, as have all of the other major powers. So I think the United States will have a lot of help over the years in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. On a lot of other issues, we may be at loggerheads with Russia and with China. I should note, you mentioned the military power of Russia. It's true Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons. It's true Russia has some advanced arms that it can use in various places. But Russia's defense budget is about 1/10 of the American defense budget. It's really not in a position to compete in the way that it did, that the Soviet Union did in the Cold War. China, both in economic and in military terms, is really the long-term sort of peer competitor of the United States. Russia is a peer of the United States in nuclear weapons terms and not in really any other terms, except perhaps culture.
Well, in your book, Preventing Black Market Trade in Nuclear Technology, you offer a compelling analysis of failure of policy, intelligence, and policies of the past governments, specifically administrations in the United States, and the challenges facing the control of illegal nuclear technology transfer. Is it true that without the explicit or implicit role of owners of nuclear technology, other countries could not have obtained it? For instance, the transfer of technology from Soviet Union to China and India, from China to Pakistan, from France to Israel, and from China, as I said, to Pakistan, from Pakistan to the Islamic Republic. So even though we kind of talk about, we pay lip service to the non-proliferation, but it seems to me that the big nuclear governments have themselves played a role in at least arming their own allies with nuclear technology. And now that the genie is out of the bottle, we are trying to put it back into bottle by coming down hard on these smaller countries.
I see the history quite differently than you see it. All of those events occurred decades and decades ago, except for the Pakistani transfer to Iran. They occurred before the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and its associated regime was really in place and took strength. What the treaty was about, in part, was the United States and the Soviet Union having learned that it was problematic to transfer nuclear weapons capabilities to their allies, in part because it meant the other side would transfer it to their allies. And Article 1 of the treaty is basically the two superpowers saying to each other, look, I won't give it to my allies if you won't give it to your allies. It's only Article 2 of the treaty that's all the non-nuclear weapon states saying, and we won't get it, and we'll accept international inspection to ensure that. That's Articles 2 and 3. I think there is now a strong international consensus against the spread of nuclear weapons, which is why it has been possible to pull together an international coalition to oppose Iran's efforts to edge toward a nuclear weapons capability. I will say, though, one more thing, which is how successful this global effort has been. There are today, out of almost 200 countries in the world, only 9 that have nuclear weapons. 30 years ago, there were 9 countries that had nuclear weapons. We added North Korea, but we subtracted South Africa. Admittedly, that's a terrible trade, but to have no net increase in 30 years is an amazing public policy success story. And I remain somewhat optimistic that 30 years from now, we might have the same or even a smaller number of states with nuclear weapons. That's not inevitable. It will take a lot of work and a lot of good policy to make that happen. But I think it remains possible and ought to be our goal. Now, in terms of the trade in technology, I think that essentially every nuclear weapons program has benefited from technology from outside, even the original one from the United States. But I think that at the same time, there's a lot that countries can do if the technology is cut off to build it on their own. It'll take longer, it will cost more. So the efforts to stop technology flow can't be the only part of the effort to stem the spread of nuclear weapons. What it does is it buys time, it slows things down so that diplomacy and other means of action have time to work. I think it can still play that role, but it is getting more difficult as things like 3D printing make it possible to manufacture things in a wide range of places where you weren't able to manufacture them before.
Yes. And we only have about 3 more minutes before the end of this interview. And I have this question that I have to ask, even if you just give me a very short answer. Matthew Kroenig, in his book, The Logic of an American Nuclear Strategy, argues that for decades, the U.S. nuclear weapons policy has been that the United States only needs the ability to absorb an enemy nuclear attack and still be able to respond with a devastating counterattack. So if that is the U.S. policy, why is that not applied towards the negotiations with Iran? Obviously, U.S. has more than ability to absorb any challenge that the Iranian government can offer the U.S. arsenal and the U.S. military firepower.
The United States doesn't want to live in a nuclear deterrent relationship with every country on Earth. The more fingers that are on the nuclear button, the more likely it is somebody's going to press that nuclear button. We lived in a nuclear deterrent relationship with the Soviet Union because we didn't have any choice. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. They had enough that could survive an American attack, that we didn't have any ability to get rid of them. And so we pursued arms control and confidence building measures and hotlines and military to military dialogue and so on to try to reduce the very real and serious dangers of that situation. We desperately want to avoid having more really dangerous situations like that, including nuclear weapons in Iran.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bunn, for your gracious agreement of giving us an hour of your time to discuss this very important issue. Your insight is very appreciated, and we are hoping that in the future we can count on being with you about this particular very important issue, the issue that's important for the international community, as well as Iranians who watch this program on IDEA TV. I thank you again and hope to see you in this show once again in the near future.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Thank you very much.